Okay, we're going to do another little session of Know Your Cathedral, or whatever we want to call it, but again, the purpose of these little sessions, video sessions, is to point out some little known features of the cathedral, the features that, you know, oftentimes people have been going to this cathedral for years and years and years we're not aware of. So we left off with the north transept, and now we're going to pick up on the south transept. And the first thing I want to point out in this transept is above the window, there's another symbol. It's the Alpha and the Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. And we talked last week about the IHS on the other side and the language that was couched in. And actually this one will just muddy the waters a little further if you want to get into the discussion of what language Jesus actually spoke. As I said last week, I think we know pretty definitively he didn't speak English, and we also know pretty definitively that he didn't speak Greek. And the Alpha and the Omega is constantly used in Catholic art and representation, and it comes from a passage in Revelation where John, who wrote Revelation, is talking about after Jesus has ascended to the heavens and taken his place on the throne, he then declares, I am the Alpha and the Omega, according to John, the first and the last. Now, if Jesus, again, it's not really clear, but there's a lot of discussion. What language did Jesus speak? Well, it may have been Hebrew and it may have been Aramaic, but as I said last week, it certainly wasn't English, and it certainly wasn't Greek either, because Greek was in use in the Roman Empire at that time, but it was reserved almost totally for the very educated classes. And I think there's no disputing the fact that Jesus was not a member of the educated class. He was the son of a carpenter. He was a carpenter himself. So he certainly didn't speak Greek. But John in Revelations has Jesus actually using those two Greek words. If Jesus spoke Hebrew, he would have said, I am the Aleph and the Tau. Those are the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So again, Greek gives a lot of the art to our churches, and Greek has actually sneaked in a little bit of language in our churches. I don't know how many people are aware of it. The Kyrie eleison is actually Greek, a long-standing integral part of our Mass. The Mass for centuries was said in Latin, but even always, no matter what language, Latin or English, the Kyrie eleison is Greek. So that's the Alpha and the Omega. Stepping down to look at some of the windows in the south transept here, I'm going to start with the, I guess that would be the east window there. There's a lady dressed in an untabard. That is Saint Rita of Koskia. And Rita is a very interesting saint. We're told that she was married when she was 12, and also that she had her first child when she was 12. And she was in a pretty unhappy marriage. Rita is sometimes spoken of as the patron saint of abused women, because her husband was a criminal and he was involved in all kinds of unsavory ventures, And eventually, at some point, he was murdered. And her sons at that time were like 14 and 16, and they swore to avenge their father. They were going to kill the people who had killed their father. And Rita is a good example of be careful what you pray for, because you may get it. Because Rita was a very holy lady, and she prayed to God. She said something along the line of, don't let my sons become murderers. I'd rather have my sons dead than have them murderers. And within a year, both sons died of cholera. So Rita was now a widow, no children living, and so she entered the convent. And that's why Rita is dressed in a nun's habit, even though she was the mother of 2 young boys. Rita's a kind of an obscure saint. I didn't know anything about her until I began researching some of this stuff. But in the early 20th century, when the cathedral was built, there was a very, very active Catholic women's group called the St. Rita Society. And that's where this window came from. St. John, I don't believe there is a St. Rita Society, at least not in this church anymore, but as I said, it was very involved in parish life in the early part of the 20th century. And it was the St. Rita Society that dedicated the money for that window. And that's how we got St. Rita up there. Now we're looking at the window on the west side of the south transept. And I don't even have to introduce the saint. Everybody knows who that saint is. It's interesting, I'm a docent at the cathedral, I give tours, and even non-Catholics know who the guy, all dressed in green and holding a shamrock is. That's, of course, St. Patrick. And Patrick is a pretty interesting saint as well. He's the patron saint of Ireland, of course, but Patrick wasn't Irish. Patrick was a 5th century son of a noble family in England at that time. Actually, it was England at that time was being ruled by Rome. So Patrick was an Englishman by birth. He was kidnapped by pirates, raiders from Ireland, and taken back to Ireland, where he served as a slave, a sheepherder and a slave for many, many years. Again, Patrick's life is, a lot of it is speculation, a lot of it is, well, we think this is what happened. And some of it is very interesting, because if you read Patrick actually wrote, he called it, I believe, his confessions. If you read his confession, he doesn't talk at all about driving the snakes out of Ireland, but he does talk about killing a man. And he was very conflicted and worried about that. He had, probably in his escape endeavor, he had apparently killed somebody. And he felt that sin, I mean, he would never have viewed himself as a saint, because he felt that sin kind of haunted him for the rest of his life. So that's Patrick. We're still in that east window area of the south transept, and we're going to talk a little bit about the statue of the Sacred Heart. Again, in giving tours to non-Catholics, I get a lot of questions about this. I mean, obviously, all Christian religions believe in Jesus, but his representation as the Sacred Heart is not something that most people are familiar with. So this is the statue of Jesus as the Sacred Heart. This is one of the more expensive statues in the cathedral. I mean, it's solid marble. A lot of statues that you see in Catholic churches are concrete or plaster, but all of our statues, I believe, are, they're marble. Jesus has had quite a journey in this church. When the church was first built, this statue was up on the altar, right about where the Cathedral is now. And then when we did the renovation in the 1970s, almost 1980s, this statue was moved to the back of the church. Over here, before the renovation, was a confessional, and there was a confessional on the other side too. And the confessionals were moved downstairs, but so Jesus in this personification as the Sacred Heart has been in this location, I don't believe it's been a month yet. And again, it's a good prominent position for our statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Okay, now we're going to talk about the primary piece of artwork in this south transept, and that is the Ascension Window. This is the scene. The Bible tells us Christ was pretty much just visiting, talking to the apostles, and all of a sudden he was lifted up into heaven. They had no real warning. They didn't know what was happening. I like to point out in this window, and it should be obvious to a lot of people, I'll point out two things. I'd like to point out in this window that this is the apostles watching Jesus ascend in heaven. And of course, there are only 11 apostles. And we all know there were 12 apostles originally, and I love to ask this question, and most people get it right. I tell people, count the apostles, how many? And they'll count 11, and then I say, well, who's missing? And most often, people will pick up on the fact that it's Judas. Judas is missing because just 40 days or so before this, he had betrayed Jesus, and because he'd done that, he killed himself. He went out and hung himself, and subsequently there was a new apostle picked. So there's only 11 apostles in this window. I've been asked lots of times whether we can identify the apostles in this window. And I think the answer is probably maybe. You can find a lot of early Christian writing and early Christian artwork, and this would not be really early. This scene was probably originally painted in the 14th, 16th centuries. I don't know, not on our window, but the scene that it depicts. And there are characteristics assigned to almost all of the apostles. That this apostle had a full beard and he was balding. Or this apostle had short hair and no beard. And this, you can go through that and you can more or less identify, if you use those characteristics, you can more or less identify each of the 12 apostles. So I've actually done that, but short of putting post-it notes up there on the window on each of these guys, I don't know of any good way to really communicate that. And I really couldn't relay it to you without looking at my notes. This is the last thing I'll mention about this window, and the same is true for the window in the north transept. Clearly, these are the largest windows in the cathedral, and clearly they are the most expensive ones. They would have been. They were. But it's mind-boggling to me when I look at that stained glass, the amazing artistry and work that went into that. And when I realized, and again, because I've got those records, that window only cost $2,400. You know, you'd be hard-pressed to buy a good piece of garden art for your yard for $2,400 today. That window, and the north one too, cost $2,400. So we're now over at, again, I think we quickly alluded to this in one of the earlier presentations. This was the Mary altar. There were originally when the church was built, there were 3 altars. There was the main high altar, there was a Mary altar, and there was a Joseph altar. Okay. So we're over at the Mary altar, and it's framed, in essence, by the Mary window. And if you look at this, they're pretty much the same representation of Mary. This is Mary as the Immaculate Conception. And again, something that a lot of people don't notice unless they look closely at these statues or portrayals, and it's a common portrayal of Mary. She's standing on a serpent. It's much more pronounced on the other side of this statue. If you go, you can definitely see the serpent's head, and she's got her foot on it. You can see the serpent's tail here. And the same is in the window. Look carefully, you can see the serpent. Mary standing on it. This it comes from a Catholic interpretation of the story in Genesis of the fall, and it talks about when the serpent, or Satan, tempts Adam and Eve. Then after he does it, God tells him, because you have done this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and she will strike at your head, and you will strike at her heel. And that's the portrayal here. Mary has the serpent under her heel. Okay, from this angle, we can see more easily the snake under Mary's foot here on the right-hand side of the statue. And he's got an apple in his mouth, and I think there's also a leaf from the apple tree. But the one thing I really wanted to point out on this one is that when, as I mentioned earlier, when the church was built, this was actually an altar. A priest very often might have said Mass at this altar. Never, not on a Sunday. On a Sunday, they always said Mass on the high altar. But during the week or something, a priest might very well have said Mass on this altar or on the other altar. And when this was an altar, there was another couple steps up to here. But this was the tabernacle. They filled it in with marble when they did the renovation, but this was the tabernacle. And what I find fascinating about this is that on either side of the tabernacle, there are these kind of demonic figures. A human face, claws, a coiled serpent-like body, and I really have never been able to find any explanation or rationale for why the tabernacle would have been surrounded with demonic figures. And now we're over on the other side, we're at the St. Joseph altar. And again, just like on the Mary altar, the St. Joseph altar has a statue, and it has a stained glass window portraying, well, it's not quite the same scene. In the statue, Joseph is holding the Christ child, in the window he is not. But in both portrayals, Joseph is holding a blooming plant. It's a lily. It's holding a blooming lily. And this is, again, an old Catholic story. Actually, I don't hear it being told much anymore, but I certainly remember in grammar school that Joseph, when he was wrestling with the question of should he really take Mary as his wife, was holding a plant, a branch or something, and it blossomed, it bloomed. It's a lily, just like that one is, and so that was God's way of telling him, you know, this is a miracle. This dead branch, and in some portrayals it's actually a staff, like a shepherd's staff that Joseph was holding with a lily blossom on top of it. But anyway, the plant blossomed, and that was his way of knowing that he should take Mary as his wife, and he was going to act as the foster father for the Christ child. And again, this depiction has the same on either side of what was in the tabernacle are these very bizarre, unpleasant-looking creatures. The other thing we have over here, and it's a fairly recent addition to this part of the church anyway, is the baptismal font. This was the original baptismal font in our church when it was first built in 1920. And it was in the baptistry in the back of the church. The baptistry is, we use it as a vesting room now, but that was the baptistry. We'll talk about that in another presentation because there's a couple of interesting features in that baptistry. But this font was donated to the church when it was being built by a very prominent family in town. And I'm not going to mention the name because there are still members of that family very prominent in this community. But the font was donated by that family as a baptismal font. And it was used as a baptismal font until 1979 when we did the renovation. And then they put in the hot tub, or whatever here, and decommissioned the font, totally decommissioned it. They used it, it was the base on which the sacred oils were kept. Throughout the year until they were used. But that changing of the baptismal font to essentially a pedestal or a base for the sacred oil did not sit well with the family who had donated it originally as a baptismal font. And there was actually some suggestion that we want our font back. We didn't donate a pedestal for oils. We donated a baptismal font. Obviously that didn't happen. We still have the original font, and it's now about to be reused as it was originally intended. So we're now going to talk about the last statue in our church. And this is a statue of St. Anthony of Padua. St. Anthony has a couple sponsorships, I guess, or patronages. Certainly, Anthony is the patron saint of lost items. Okay, you lose your car keys, you say a prayer to St. Anthony's, and the keys will turn up. And I always like to, again, give our Protestant friends the little prayer for St. Anthony that I don't even know when I was taught it as a child somewhere. But when you lose those car keys or your cell phone or your wallet or whatever you lose, you say this prayer. Tony, Tony, look around. Something's lost and must be found. And I guarantee you it'll work. A lot of people ask, why is St. Anthony holding a rock? He's not holding a rock, actually. I mean, it could be, but it's supposed to be a loaf of bread. St. Anthony was famous for his charity to the poor, and he would feed the poor. So he's got a loaf of bread in one hand, and he's got a book and the Christ child on the other arm. And Anthony was never a contemporary of Christ, so this is based again on a story that Anthony had, well, it goes to both sponsors, that Anthony had lost a favorite psaltery of his book of prayers, and he prayed to the Christ child to find it for him, and the Christ child came to him with the psaltery, and so he's holding his found book and the Christ child. What I like to point out about Anthony is a fairly unique physiological feature. Anthony has Morton's toe. So, who is Morton and how come Anthony's got his toe? Well, Morton's toe is a medical term for a fairly common physiological characteristic where the second toe is longer than the first toe. About 30-40% of people that you're likely to meet will have Morton's toe. And Morton's toe actually is very more prominent among the Mediterranean peoples, the northern Mediterranean peoples, Greeks, Italians. And that's why, because that's a common physical feature of those races, and that's where we got our statuary and artwork from the Greeks. And so it was a normal characterization of a human body to have Morton's toe in early Greek art. And it's just come down to us over the years. Actually, if you look at, I haven't looked carefully at Mary or Joseph, but the Sacred Heart of Jesus has Morton's toe as well. So that's a little story. And one last little quick thing I'd like to point out here, which I think is interesting. And it's over on this wall. Because the artwork in our cathedral is all painted. It's not wallpaper, it's not stamped or anything. It's painted. It's painted with stencils, I'm sure, but it is painted. And people are amazed if you look at all of the artwork and all the decorations around the windows and whatnot. Those were all hand painted. And you can see that there's an error here. If you look at the other side, if you look at any of the other depictions of the window, it looks like the paint ran or something here. And it's the only window that has that. But again, it's a clear, there's also a drop of paint here. It's also a clear indication of the workmanship that went into our cathedral. Okay, we're in the original baptistry of our church, and I'd like to talk about a couple of unique features in the baptistry. And again, these are things that I think people really never notice, and they're can be kind of significant. The first is that this cabinet back here where the vestments are kept, this was one of the original confessionals in the church. And if you look at, as I said, old pictures of the church, they were up in the extreme corners of the two transepts. But they decided to repurpose it and to save some beautiful carpentry and carving and decoration. But this was where the priest went in and the penitent went in the other side. They didn't have double doors, but they repurposed them to a cabinet. This was the baptistry, and that baptismal font I talked about earlier sat right below this lantern, right in the center. And this is where baptisms were performed. There's several unique, you know this is the baptistry if you look at that window on the north wall. That's John the Baptist baptizing the Christ child. And then if you look at the window on the east wall, that is the guardian angel watching over small children. I think we've all, Catholics of my generation anyway, were taught that when you were baptized, you had assigned to you a guardian angel who would take care of you and watch over you. And this is what I find intriguing about this window, because there are two children. There should be two guardian angels. Everybody has their own guardian angel. You don't have to share your guardian angel with anybody. So there should be two guardian angels. Or perhaps one of those children isn't a Catholic. That would be the obvious answer to me. And then we'll look at the cherubs up here at the base of the pillars. There are hundreds, there are thousands of cherubs. Well, I don't know, I've never tried to count them, but maybe we could assign that to some 8th grader for extra credit or something. Count the cherubs, and how many are there actually? But the cherubs, if you look at them, the ones beneath the choir loft appear to be singing, and the others around the various sides and whatnot have kind of neutral faces. But look at these two cherubs here. They are crying. They're bawling. And this is exactly what a small child does when you put cold water on his head or her head. So this again is just, to me, indicative of the kind of thought and maybe even whimsy that the artist put into this. He said, this is going to be a baptistry. It's going to be full of crying kids. So we're going to make those cherubs crying kids. And the last thing I'd mention in here, in the baptistry, or in the vesting room, is this very large brass crucifix. That was the crucifix that sat on our main altar from 1921 until 1979 when they moved it out. And it's a good place for it. It's not seen by too many people, but it's a beautiful and very expensive piece of artwork. Okay, this is the last part of the church we're going to talk about today, and this is what by any other name would be a vestibule, okay? But in church architecture, it's called the narthex. And I like that, narthex. It sounds uniquely Catholic, Coming to my narthex. But this, a couple of things that are interesting about this narthex are, first, if you look up there, you can see the decoration on that. It's pretty elaborate. I think those are acanthus plants on the top, and then just decorative scroll work. But that was meant to go all the way around outside the church. And if you look at the outside, it's pretty plain. They didn't do it because that would have been very expensive to carve the stone in that. Now this is plaster, so they're fairly easy to put it in here. And Bishop, I don't know whether it was Glorio or Gorman, but one of them decided we're not going to run that all the way around. That's too expensive. We'd have to carve all that sandstone up there. I always like to point out that this area here is about 3 times the size of the O'Farrell cabin. We talked about the O'Farrell cabin, I think, the first Catholic church, first place of Catholic worship in Boise, and it's about 200 square feet, and this place is about 600 square feet. And I always find that fascinating, that for years they said Mass in that little tiny space. And this is just kind of a pass-through space on your way into the church. And then the last thing I point out here are these 2 pieces of artwork. They're fairly recent additions to our church. I want to say 10, 15 years at most. One is Jesus as the divine mercy, the rays of light coming from him. And the other, of course, is the iconic Our Lady of Guadalupe. These are both fairly recent additions to our church. And, a lot of people don't realize that Our Lady of Guadalupe, of all of the Marian devotions, Our Lady of Guadalupe is by far the oldest. 1531 or something. So Lourdes, Fatima, and Knock, and some of those other places, they're all in the 18th or 19th century. But it was in the 16th century that Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared. Okay, we've wrapped up our presentation for today. I think there's some interesting, I don't know if it's useful, but interesting information in it. And again, I would encourage you, if you really want to delve into any of these topics or subjects, get your own copy of Stone Wondrously Hewn. It's the history of our cathedral, and everything I've talked about today is in there and more.